Hey everybody, it's your boy, and a few years ago I made a video where I highlighted my frustrations with my own generation, the millennials, or as our actual name is, Generation Y. In the video I ranted about how we failed to live up to expectations to our potential considering what we've grown up in regards to our technology, the internet, our ability to find new information and to bring about new ways of thinking and to go our own paths. I was complaining about how we keep falling for the same old leftist lies and tricks, and how we're going to be repeating the same mistakes that the boomers and Generation X did way before us. And I also talked about other things, if I remember correctly, like attitude to work, attitude to life, etc, etc. And really, although there's some things are true, and are true about certain types of millennials, I've had a lot of soul searching, and I feel that I may have a more informed opinion on this than I did a while back, now that I'm approaching 30. Yes, believe it or not, I may not look it, I may not sound it, but I am in fact close to becoming a 30-year-old boomer. And I came up with an idea which probably isn't very original, maybe somebody already came up with this, and I have seen other people on Twitter say this after I said it. The millennials, Generation X, the Zoomers after us, and even the boomers and silent generation, in particular the younger ones born during the 30s and the 40s, are not to blame for what has gone on, at least not the origins, and certainly not what put everything in motion. If anything, we are the products of that. Now, yes, we do have a blame for continuing these things, and for poisoning future generations, but the fault for the problems of our world do not fall with us. The boomers are actually not to blame. It was not the silent generation or the boomers that ruined the modern world, that have set in motion the events that led to the collapse of Western civilization as we know it, although they did continue a lot of the policies that they should have got rid of. It was actually the people before them. I'm talking about the so-called greatest generation, people who fought in World War II and before them in World War I, and maybe some of the older ones born in the 1800s. Think about it. Look at all the politicians around the time of the 1920s to the 1940s and 50s. How old were they? When were they born? A lot of them were born in between the years of the late 1860s to about the 1890s and in the early 1900s and 10s at a push. Think Lloyd George, think Woodrow Wilson, Churchill. It was them that ultimately laid the foundations for the problems that we would later have to deal with 100 years down the line. It is not a coincidence that during World War I, and even a little time before that, increasing state control of society and of the mechanisms of humanity began to be implemented, and only became worse and worse as time went on, in particular after the World Wars, where they tested a lot of this implementation. And then most famously in Britain and other European countries, and to a lesser extent in the United States, who already went through this with the New Deal, we had a period of massive nationalisation and state control, which is ironic because we just fought a war against one country, in fact 3 countries, that had a massive state control and nationalisation and were totalitarian, and we ended up adopting a lot of the things that they did. The NHS, nationalisation of industry, the unions becoming ever more powerful, gun control in Britain especially and in other European countries depending on your context. All of this heightened during the mid to late 20th centuries. The only time during the 20th century where this was not the case was the 1980s to about the early 1990s, where things were liberalised. Think Thatcher and Reagan and all those other politicians, the monetarist revolution, so to speak. And even then, that was an anomaly and nowhere near as free as people make out the 80s to be, or to be as oppressive as the left like to claim it was. But these people are not attacked for this. These people are either largely forgotten or are praised for the good things that they did, but the bad are not necessarily acknowledged. It seems far more convenient if you're a younger person to blame the boomers, because the boomers are currently the most oldest people in society right now, apart from some of the silent generation, and they are the ones who are the most visible when it comes to politicians. Very few people alive today remember the likes of Churchill, much less people remember Woodrow Wilson or Lloyd George. More people are alive today that remember boomer generation era politicians than those who remember pre-boomer generation politicians. And also because of our culture, think of the 1960s and how much that has had an effect on us. The boomers were the driving force in that, and also the younger silent generation types. Think of the music, the politicians, all of that is to do with them. And that has been ingrained in our skulls since we were kids. So no wonder when we look back into the causes of the culture war as far back as we can go, we don't go to World War One. We don't go to the 1930s, we go to the 60s, because it's a decade that is as close to us now as World War One was back to then. The effects of the 60s we are still feeling to this very day, and we have people alive today that we can reference and ask for what their experiences were back then. We don't blame the people that raised the boomers and created the context within which the boomers were brought up, raised in, and ultimately became the adults and leaders that they became. But it's not the boomers' fault. They were raised to be like that. Yes, there was the counterculture and stuff like that, but that had its origins in other left-wing and other weird ideological stuff from other previous generations, like Herbert Marcuse, who was born in the 1890s, for example. And likewise, for a lot of the older generation who were blind until relatively recently to what exactly has happened, it's far easier to blame the millennials than it is to blame themselves or even Gen X. Because the idea that they raised their kids wrong, the idea that they made mistakes of such epic proportions during their youth and in their middle age, is something that they don't want to admit. It's not just politicians that find it hard to admit mistakes. No parent, no person who considers themselves moral, somebody who considers themselves to have lived a good life, can stand up and say, I made a mistake. I should have raised my kids better. I should have raised my kids in a better environment, and maybe I shouldn't have took them to a state school. I should have done something different. Why would they? Very few people have done. Just like how the TERFs can't admit that what they did in the 70s influenced the intersectionals, the boomers and the silent generation types can't admit that it was their own beliefs that were imparted to some extent from the older generation, and also other ideologies that were contemporary to them, have had an effect on us. It's not a coincidence that the first generation that was wrapped in cotton wool, Gen X, would sooner or later wrap the whole of society in cotton wool, because that's all they've ever known. Millennials did not cause the death of the academe. They did not cause intersectionalism to happen. In fact, intersectionalism was created long before any millennial was even born. 10 to 20 years before any one of them were born, in fact. What millennials are guilty of was not recognising, mainly because a lot of them were young and didn't know any better, that this stuff was wrong and that they should be questioning it at every given time. Now, I'm not trying to absolve the younger generations of any and all blame, just some blame. And likewise for the older generations, I want to absolve them of some of the blame, but also to blame them for other things. The real root cause of all our issues stems 100 years before any of us were born. And it remains to be seen, ultimately, what the millennials and zoomers will do once we gain power, because there is such a thing that I've noticed is called generational power, when a generation assumes control over society. It's totally natural, and the whole of humanity has gone through this and will continue to go through this until we go extinct. Usually, by the time this generation is in their 40s to roughly 60s, is when they start to take control of society and mould it into their own image and have the most influence over the younger generation. This is also when they have young kids or kids beginning to grow up into adulthood. Look at all the current politicians who are reigning in their countries, be they monarchies or republics, etc., etc. The average age group is their 40s to 60s, with some exceptions. Very few of them are actually that old. Biden and Trump and Putin, I do believe, also, and Merkel, I think as well, they're exceptions. They're actually far too old, and they're called far too old for a reason, because the average politician, the average president, prime minister, king or queen, will usually be in their 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Very few young people are gifted enough to become leaders. That's why William Pitt the Younger, to this day, is still the youngest British prime minister, and likewise, very old people are also exceptions, much like Biden and President Reagan, for example. Once the Zoomers and Millennials reach that age, and we do start to see the average politician reflect people of Millennial age or Zoomer age, then we can start looking back and seeing what we accomplished. And eventually, after we've all pretty much retired, then we can truly cast judgment and reflect on what we did right and what we did wrong. Thankfully, there's plenty of time to correct a lot of mistakes that were made in the past, and to rectify things that we've made in the present. I'm much less black-pilled about the future of my generation, and even the Zoomers, even though I may look like I dislike them, I don't. We all have plenty of time to fix this issue, but It's going to take a lot of hard work. But the clock is ticking, and time flies very quickly when you're having fun. Honestly, the best thing we can do for humanity, the best thing we can do for the West, or for any other area of the world, is not necessarily to help ourselves, which will always be a bonus, but what we really need to do is to make sure that the next 2 to 3, maybe 4 generations will grow up to actually be based and red-pilled, as people wrongly assume Zoomers to be. Those people are our future, and if they are the ones who are brought up in an environment and with the correct principles and morals to lead a better life and to create a better society, then we will be in good shape. There's no point complaining about the boomers did this, the millennials did that, Generation X did nothing whatsoever, the Zoomers are great, the Zoomers are bad. Let's talk about the people who are growing up right now. Let's try and help them become the best that they can possibly be, to be better than us. Isn't that the whole point of having children and new generations of people? We're all adults now. Zoomers for the most part are still teenagers but becoming adults. We can help ourselves. It's up to us to make ourselves better. But for young children, the babies that are currently being born now, we're really going to have to make sure that we really help them become the best. Especially after all that's gone on with the pandemic, there's going to be a lot of people who will grow up to be dysfunctional. And we need to mitigate that as much as possible, which means being better parents, better teachers, better everything than everybody who came before. And luckily, we've got time. So anyway, that's all I've got to say on the matter. So until next time, it's been your boy, and I'll see you all later.